Albert DeMeo was born on September 7, 1940, in Bath Beach, Brooklyn. His immediate family were all immigrants from Naples who had left a life of crushing poverty behind in their native Italy to pursue the American dream. When he was a child, Roy's family only ever spoke Italian in the small apartment they shared, and as a result, he found it difficult to fit in with his elementary school classmates. His formative years were characterized by alienation, poverty, violence, and cruelty, and given that he didn't excel academically, Roy quickly began to see organized crime as being his only path to wealth and power. When he was in his late teens, an uncle of his asked him if he was looking for work. Roy had no idea what the job was, only that his uncle had connections with the Gambinos, one of the 5 families that dominated organized crime in New York City at the time. He accepted, and so began a descent into the shady, blood-soaked world of Italian-American organized crime. Roy proved that he had a penchant for brutal, methodical violence and thorough discretion, and this quickly began to turn the heads of the Gambino family's capos, senior members of the criminal gang who were in charge of its day-to-day operations. Roy was reliable, punctual, and a stone-cold killer, everything they could possibly want in a young soldier. It wasn't long before word reached acting boss Paul Castellano, who was so impressed with Roy's loyalty and enthusiasm that he began to give him more and more responsibility. By the time he was just 31 years old, Roy's meteoric rise in the ranks of the Gambino crime family meant that he was put in charge of his very own crew, one that was both feared and respected all throughout the 5 boroughs of New York. The DeMeos, as they came to be known, were the only crew trusted to deal with some of the grislier work that Castellano needed doing, and as a result they became notorious for the macabre ways in which they killed and disposed of the people marked for death by the heads of the family. The DeMeos were thought to have racked up a body count well into the low hundreds, with the vast majority of the killing actually committed by Roy himself. And the fact that they got away with so many murders was down to Roy instituting a very specific process of murdering and dismembering victims, one that they began to call the Gemini Method. Named after the Gemini Lounge, a nightclub which members of the DeMeos frequented for both business and pleasure, the Gemini Method was a set of established procedures that ensured their victims would simply vanish from the face of the earth. Multiple former crew members detailed the same grim method to FBI agents when they entered various witness protection programs in the early 1980s, all taught to them by Roy DeMeo himself. The victim was first lured to the side door of the Gemini Lounge, then into an apartment in the rear of the building. Hiding in this apartment would be a DeMeo executioner, sporting a silenced pistol and a large towel. The victim was shot in the head before the executioner would quickly wrap the towel around the dead man's skull, soaking up the blood which flowed from the bullet wound. As soon as this was done, another mafioso would take out a large knife, stabbing the victim in the heart to further stem the flow of blood from the original head wound. Then, once the victim was confirmed dead and any bleeding was under control, the crew members would drag the body into a nearby bathroom after stripping it of any and all clothing. In the apartment's bathtub, all possible blood was then drained from the body in preparation for what came next, the complete dismemberment of their poor, unsuspecting victim. The crew would carry the body back into the apartment's main room and lie it out on a large plastic sheet. There they could saw off the victim's head, arms, and legs, placing each into a trash bag which in turn was placed into a large cardboard box. The next trick was to take these cardboard boxes over to the Foster Avenue dump in Brooklyn, a place where thousands of tons of garbage was processed every single day, and one where the gruesome fruits of their labor was unlikely to be discovered. At the height of the FBI's efforts to target members of the DeMeo crew, a huge amount of time and resources were poured into trying to find the bodies of those they had killed. But a plan by federal agents to excavate sections of the Foster Avenue dump was deemed far too expensive, as well as being unlikely to yield any usable evidence. The Gemini Method was so effective that it forced the federal government to concede a defeat in the single most important area of their investigations, finding actual dead bodies. The dump located outside the Starrett City apartment complex on Pennsylvania Avenue, was eventually shut down in 1985 and subsequently concreted over. The site is now public parkland, and any traces of the DeMeo's victims are surely lost to us forever. But Roy DeMeo knew how close to perfect his method of murder was, and he relished the kind of terror people felt when they heard his name. By the early 1980s, he started to think he was untouchable, and his lust for wealth and power quickly grew beyond the control of Paul Castellano, the head of the Gambino crime family. Castellano knew that Roy had to be dealt with before he attempted some kind of coup, and began the process of putting a hit out on him. It was difficult to find someone who'd take the job. The hitmen of New York City were far from excited about the prospect of gunning for one of the most notorious killers in the history of the American Mafia. But money talks, and eventually Castellano found someone willing to rub DeMeo out. And so it came to pass that Roy DeMeo simply left his house one day and never came home. On January 10th, 1983, Roy went to a crew member's house for a meeting with his soldiers. Then that night, he failed to show up to his own daughter's birthday party. Those close to him said that they knew something was wrong almost immediately, as it was totally out of character for Roy to miss a family event like that. Then, just 10 days later, Roy's Cadillac was discovered in the parking lot of the Varuna Boat Club in Brooklyn, with his partially frozen corpse stuffed into the trunk. He had been shot multiple times in the head and had a bullet wound in his hand from where he tried to stop a torrent of lead with nothing but his outstretched palm. It was a sad, pathetic end to a life of a man who seemed more like the Grim Reaper to many of the Italian-American criminal underworld. Roy's death also preceded an FBI sweep in which the remainder of his crew were rounded up and imprisoned for life, convicted of a total of 25 murders, along with car theft and drug trafficking. The DeMeo crew had been completely wiped from existence, but they left a legacy that persists even today. The so-called Gemini method lives on in the Gambino crime family and has become a method of murder so effective and widespread that even Hollywood movies depict the process, sometimes in some disturbingly accurate reproductions too. It appears evil is capable of leaving a lasting impact just as much as good is, and Roy DeMeo's life's work has made his name a synonym for the very real horrors of American organized crime. When I was a kid, I had a couple of uncles who were middlemen for the Mafia in New Jersey. They moved guns around, money, drugs, you name it. They drove it around the state or into New York City. One of the uncles ended up getting murdered in one of the worst ways I'd ever heard. You see, he had this nasty disease in one of his kidneys that needed a whole lot of medication to keep a lid on it. The guys that got him in the end knew he had it and tortured him until he told them which one was the good one. His killers then got someone with some kind of surgical experience to straight up cut out his one working kidney, then left him in some warehouse to die of organ failure or however having a bad kidney will kill you in the end. That all happened when I was like 10 years old. I was actually related to the guy who died too, just not by blood, and the aunt he was married to hasn't never really gotten over it. She had to ID his body, and I think he was in such rough shape that it just sort of broke her. I get these stories from my dad since all the Mafia involvement is on my mom's side of the family and we hardly see these people anymore. Last time we went to any family parties or anything over in Brooklyn was like the late 90s. Then there's the neighbor I had across the street when I was a teenager in suburban New Jersey. Apparently he was Carnevali, the small-time Mafia family that was like a subdivision of some bigger, badder family. I didn't know that at the time, but the guy was a vicious loan shark and ran girls out of his house to various clients. I should have put two and two together, given that his house was like twice as big as everyone else's on the block. All the decoration, both on the inside and the outside, was incredibly gaudy too, like real Mafia chic, I guess you could say. Their kids were pretty nice. We used to play street hockey with them quite a lot, but from how weird they were, you could tell that they grew up in a very unusual household. The one and only time I went inside was when one of their kids invited me in one summer to grab some Kool-Aid. He showed off some of their super expensive super soakers they had in there, then suggested we go get hot dogs after he talked his dad out of $5. We go upstairs to his mom and dad's room, and inside is his loan shark dad dressed in some ridiculously garish silk robe, counting piles of cash on the bed with some barely dressed girl who was most definitely not my friend's mom. I mentioned that to my parents when I got home that afternoon, and as a result, I wasn't allowed to go over there anymore. I mean, everyone knew what a scumbag this guy was. He got arrested from time to time. The cops would even show up at his house while the neighbors watched him getting shoved into a patrol car in cuffs. My mom said it even made the papers from time to time. Freehold loan shark arrested in suburbia and stuff like that. One of my mom's friends even kept a little scrapbook of the headlines, her own little diary of living opposite a member of the Mafia, I suppose. I'm surprised I was even allowed to associate with the guy's kids at all, but I suppose people just sought the path of least resistance when it came to dealing with the local mob guy. From what I understand, for years the mob guy was just something of a local curiosity. Despite the debauchery he got up to in his own home, he didn't make it anyone else in the neighborhood's problem. So for the longest time, we all just sort of lived side by side with so much as a hitch. Then one day I noticed that the Mafia kids hadn't been out to play street hockey in a while. So I go up to the house, specifically against my parents' orders, and knock on the door. No answer. That was pretty much how we discovered that the Mafia family had basically just disappeared. The house was foreclosed on really fast too, and whoever took ownership of it put it up for sale almost immediately. They actually did an open house too, and since it already had something of a lived-in look, the real estate company basically just left it as it was. To other people visiting, it mustn't have meant much, but to the neighbors, it only gave it this sort of Mary Celeste kind of vibe. Haunted, I guess you could say. Like we knew the people who lived there, and we saw how suddenly the dad must have been like, "We gotta go, now." It looked like they'd all been in the middle of their days and had just up and gotten out of there, but whether that was because they were going to be pinched or whacked or whatever you want to call it, we could only guess. All the kids' clothes were still in the closet. Video game consoles were still there. I mean, considering the possibilities, it was really creepy. Like, sure, they could have just disappeared for some reason, be it the law or conflict within the Carnivali family or something, but there's also the possibility that, right under our noses, some hitman, or team of hitmen, had killed and dismembered the family before making them disappear. That being said, it's pure speculation what happened, and no one knows for certain if they were killed or not. But I do know for sure that whatever made them just up and get out of there, it couldn't have been good. And although no one really talks about it anymore, it still kind of haunts the neighborhood. For almost 20 years of my life, I lied to all but a handful of people about what I did for a living. My story was that I worked as a consultant for a big cleaning company. I'd explained that I basically got paid very handsomely to do what we called benchmark cleans, which was when an expert would scrub a place down to show the owners how clean it could be. That way they'd know if their janitorial staff were slacking off or cutting corners. I mean, it was as good a story as any. And it at least explained why I was often spotted loading cleaning supplies into the trunk of my Cadillac Alante. And in a way, a cleaner was exactly what I was. Only I was occupied with a very particular kind of cleaning that sometimes takes place after a very particular event. You see, I worked for the Italian mob in Boston, and my job was cleaning up murder scenes. As you can imagine, the profession that I fell into is not something you go to college for. And I do mean that I fell into it. It's not like I went out looking to get myself work purging crime scenes of any biological evidence. It just sort of happened that way. When I was 19, I was working in a bar owned by a very mobbed-up guy who will remain nameless for obvious reasons. I was working the end of a real slow shift one night, and the manager had gone home early, having left me with the keys to lock up. As I was doing so, 3 guys came in saying they knew the owner, and I just assumed they were interested in a little after-hours drinking, which did occur often. Two of the men led a third into a back room, and then the next thing I heard was this voice shout, "Wait," before one of the guys comes back out and tells me to bring a mop into the back room in exactly 15 minutes. I do as I'm told, and walked into the back while one of the guys explained to me that there'd be a spillage that I needed to clean up. There was this huge puddle of what was really obviously blood, and I got this mob guy telling me, "Hey, don't worry about it, it's tomato juice, just get it cleaned up already." I was terrified to go to prison in connection with that murder, should these two guys get found out. Like I was the one who let him into the bar after hours anyway. Like there's no reason why a jury wouldn't believe that I had something to do with it. So I cleaned better and faster than I'd ever cleaned anything before in my life. I mopped and scrubbed that floor thoroughly, twice, and when the two mob guys had finished off one of the expensive bottles of grappa, they came back to check my work. Needless to say, they were impressed. There wasn't a speck of blood anywhere. Not on the walls, not on the floor, nowhere. This one guy is so happy with the job I did, he slips a couple of dollar bills into my pocket and pats me on the back. I was way too scared to check the amount until I got home that night, but when I did, I found that they were 2 crinkly hundreds. And to 19-year-old me, that made me a very rich man for the night. It was only about a week when the same two guys appeared during a closing shift I was working at the bar. The manager was there at the time, and we were pretty busy since there had been a Red Sox game on, but he didn't say a word in protest when these two guys told me to follow them out to their car. I was absolutely terrified, and I was almost certain that they were going to have me killed because I could turn witness against them. They took me across the north end to a little house with a bunch of blood all over one of the back rooms. I thought it was like an abattoir for people at first, that I'd be killed there and then disposed of in whatever way these guys did their work. But to my surprise, they asked me to clean up and to just do as good a job there as I did back in the bar. Again, I do as I'm told, scrubbing every iota of blood and human tissue from that back room. It was way worse than the bar that time, as the blood had really seemed to soak into a section of the carpet, but a mix of Clorox and pure elbow grease dislodged all the discoloring, so even though it took a good few hours, by the time I was done, the room looked as good as new. This time I was paid the full amount a Mafia cleaner would normally get, $2,000, and I couldn't believe it. It was more than double my month's pay at the bar for just a few hours of work. And somehow the disgust of cleaning up all that blood was somehow overridden by my fear of the local mob. If I refused to clean, they'd most likely just off me, or I could just go along to get along and get rich doing it. 20 years of service I put in. I stopped counting the number of cleaning jobs I worked for the mob back around 100, but I must have cleaned up thousands of places in those 20 years. Every so often I'd negotiate a raise from the various crews, charged extra for larger crime scenes. Basically, I made myself a very rich man by just relinquishing any kind of moral compass I had and cleaning what needed to be clean. I kept my business quiet. I never had a run-in with the cops and never had any kind of problems or disagreements with any of the bosses or capos. They just called when they needed me and paid me when I asked, but aside from that, we never spoke. So when one of the guys I'd worked for called me up to say that me and him needed to sit down, I immediately knew something was off. When I met the capo and a few guys from his crew at a diner on the edge of town, I figured there'd at least be an agenda. But all they seemed to want to do was eat lunch and shoot the breeze. In the end, I actually had to ask the guy why he'd called me out there if it wasn't just to eat waffles. He responds by asking a bunch of cryptic questions about how many years I'd worked for them, how many jobs I'd done for them, basically my entire Mafia resume. I'm just nodding along the whole time, almost certain that the conversation wasn't going anywhere good. You see, at the time, the police department was really putting the squeeze on this guy's crew, and the capo was having people whack left and right just to keep his name out of their mouths. And I was pretty sure I'd cleaned up some of their blood, too. The way I saw it, the guy talking about how long I'd been working for them could have been a compliment to my loyalty, but also an indictment of how much I knew. and it put me in a very delicate situation because I knew he was going to try to secure my silence in one of two ways: paying my family off to keep me quiet if I was looking at a conviction, or putting a bullet in me to keep me from saying anything at all. I basically put my wife on standby to get out of there for like 2 or 3 weeks after that. The stress of it really did a number on her too, having some bags packed at all times, just waiting to get a call from me like, "We gotta get out of here," if I thought the crew were gonna make their move on me. Sure, we were worried about what was going to happen to us, but it was worrying about what was going to happen to our kids which really messed with my head. For the first couple of weeks, I didn't have to make that call. Everything seemed like it was going to be fine. I even worked a couple of jobs for the same people I thought were going to kill me, just trying to play like everything was cool. If I started acting shifty, they'd think I was a rat, and then I was definitely done for. But the moment finally came when I got a call from one of the crew to come clean up a body, only the location was basically out in the middle of nowhere. Now what gave it away was that most of the cleanups were in inner-city high-traffic areas, close neighborhoods, people who might see things, smell things. Those were my bread and butter. If a group of guys whack someone in the middle of nowhere, they can basically just kick some dirt over the body and get gone. So I give the guy a call and start probing for details about what kind of job it was, and long story short, his responses were incredibly suspicious. I actually text my wife while I was still on the phone with the guy like, "Take the kids to a motel now." I just had this gut feeling and I wasn't about to take any chances. So I tell the guy I'm on my way, but really I drive home to see if the wife got out okay. When I cruise past the street we lived on to scope out the driveway, the first thing that gets my attention is this big black SUV just sat across from the house. My wife's car was gone, and that was a plus, but she must have barely gotten out of there in time. And I knew well that whoever sat in that SUV was there to do us harm. Given the distance between us, I managed to just back off and drive away before they noticed me, but the whole time I was in complete, full panic mode. I was texting my wife, making sure she drove way outside of the city before she found somewhere to stay, all the while bluffing the mob guy, telling him the traffic was terrible but I was still on my way. I hadn't been that scared since I was a teenager, and I first had my run-in with those mob guys in the bar I worked at. I'm sweating through my shirt in the driver's seat of my car, taking calls from this guy and having to pretend that it was just a regular day at the office. Now those guys were brutal, but they weren't too smart, and me and my wife managed to get the kids out and disappear over the next couple of days. I changed my phone, bought a different car. Basically my life as I knew it had just gone up in smoke, and we'd have to just start again somewhere new. But the last thing that guy said to me over the phone when he finally realized I was jumping ship still makes my skin crawl to this day. At first he asked after my kids in this nice polite way, asked how they were doing in school, all this other stuff. Then he starts telling me that if I just do the right thing, then they'll all be okay. But when I told him I just couldn't do that, he finally lost his temper. Jesus Christ, the things he said he'll do to my wife were enough to keep me up at night. But the things he'd said he'd do to my 2 young daughters made me feel physically sick even today. I got rid of my phone after that and never spoke to the guy again. Like I said, my life is completely different now, and I'm sure you'll understand if I spare you the details. Even submitting this story, I'm really doing it as anonymously as I can. I just wanted to get it off my chest because it's been weighing on me. Wanted to tell somebody. But the way I feel about my time working for the mob is kind of like this old saying I once heard about appeasing people. How you feed the crocodile, hoping that it'll eat you last. That's exactly what I did with the mob. And in the end, it really did try to eat me, too. So, we're going back to the early 90s for this one, when I used to live out in Brooklyn. In 1992, I moved from rural Ohio all the way out to the Big Apple to pursue my dreams of being an artist. It was one of the scariest things I've ever done, but I have very few regrets. Living in NYC was one of the happiest, most exciting times of my life. And although I had no money at all, I have a wealth of great friends and good stories because of my time living there, as well as some not-so-great stories too. Anyway, I lived in a place in Brooklyn called Brighton Beach. A lot of you will be familiar with the area because, according to my kid anyway, it's a place you start off in the video game GTA 4. It's right next to Coney Island, has a bunch of above-ground railways over the streets, same place where the car chase takes place in that old French Connection movie too, I think. But what Brighton Beach is more commonly known as these days is Little Odessa, or Little Russia, because of the large amount of Eastern European immigration the area got. Russian-speaking people have been flocking there since the 1970s, but after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that level of immigration went through the roof. Nowadays, it's not entirely uncommon to see stores or restaurants in Brighton Beach with Russian characters on them. Cyrillic, I believe it's called. And much like any group of people who emigrated to the United States, they brought along their customs, their religions, and most significant to this story, their organized crime. So I had this buddy when I lived out in Brooklyn, one I used to hang out with a whole lot. One day we're walking past this Russian cafe when a fight spills out into the street. These Russian guys are kicking the tails of these American guys, really putting the hurt on them. Me and my buddy are just watching from across the street, just gawping like people normally do whenever there's a street fight. The American guys start running away, and this one Russian guy actually hulks out of his shirt. I think it was a button-up though, so not a true Hulk moment, and starts shouting after the fleeing American guys. He had these tattoos all over his chest and back, pictures of those domes they have on Russian churches, all this other religious iconography, and he also had these 2 stars on each of his shoulders, like an old-style design that reminded me of the directional pointers on old maps. Anyway, we just kept walking before the Russian guys caught us staring and thought that would be the end of it. But as it turns out, my buddy was pretty fascinated by the tattoo designs, and in a spur-of-the-moment decision decides to get himself a pair of shoulder stars similar to the kind the Russian guy had on him. Admittedly, they did look pretty cool, and I understood when my buddy wanted to show them off during the summer that followed. But when he did, we found some pretty weird things that would happen whenever we were out in public. For example, one time we went to this little pelmeni place we used to visit all the time. Pelmeni are these little dumpling-type things, really cheap, really filling, so they made up quite a big chunk of our diet when I called Brooklyn home. Anyway, we eat a bunch of dumplings, drink a few shots of cheap vodka, and then go to pay the check. The service had been extra good that day, and we intended on tipping what little we could, but the owners wouldn't take our money. No matter how much we insisted, the guy behind the counter just laughed nervously and kept pushing our hands away while talking to my buddy with the tattoos in Russian. We were most definitely broke enough not to refuse a free meal, so we went on our way and didn't think too much about it. But as the weeks went by, stuff like that kept happening. People would randomly speak Russian to my buddy. People acted real skittish around him, and while we didn't really know why, I remember having a hunch that it had something to do with the tattoos. A hunch that was confirmed when one of the Russian-speaking incidents turned pretty nasty. This big bear of a guy walks up to my buddy and greets him warmly in Russian. My buddy's all like, "Sorry man, I don't speak Ruski." And the dude's expression changes entirely. He starts poking my buddy real hard where his tattoos are, speaking angrily in Russian the whole time. Whoever was with him only barely restrained him from kicking my buddy's butt right there, and we were left confused and frightened. After that, my buddy didn't show off his tattoos so much anymore, and in fact, he didn't have them for much longer. Not because he had them removed either. That whole tattoo removal was expensive as heck back then and wasn't anything like the exact science it is today. He didn't have them for much longer because, one night, he got a knock on his apartment door. He answered, and these big guys in tracksuits burst through his door before grabbing him and forcing his shirt off. And then, with the help of a hot clothes iron, they burned and cut those stars off his shoulders until there was nothing left but raw flesh. I remember going to visit him in the hospital, and he told me the gist of what happened. Not too much detail, I just put that together myself. It was the most horrifying thing I'd ever heard, and as you can imagine, my buddy was severely traumatized. His parents had to pay his hospital bills, and he moved back to Vermont to live with them not long after. And after that, I stayed well away from any of the Russian cafes where large men in tracksuits seemed to hang out all day, doing very little. Knowing that I lived so close to people who were capable of such horrific violence, it seriously gave me the creeps. I live in Columbus now, a long way away from the Russian Mafia on Brighton Beach. But what happened to my Bright Beach buddy still haunts me, and it explains why I'm so vehemently against any of my kids getting tattoos. When I was just 14 years old, I was dumb enough to join a gang. I mean, I should clarify a little that I wasn't like some big-time criminal dropping bodies or moving weight. Me and my homies were young when we joined, and we were considered shorties to the actual grown men over in East Chicago. But if we stuck around and did as we're told, we had a chance to be jumped in and marked at 16. Not going to lie, we were nothing but a bunch of wannabes. There were a couple of older kids who were our mentors, but for the most part, it was a bunch of teenagers playing hard until they were old enough to be actual corner boys. It was dumb, and actually pretty dangerous, but it gave me what I needed during that time, a sense of belonging. My family had just gotten out of the projects of Gary, Indiana, to a little neighborhood right outside of Gary. Living there as a mixed-race Dominican who looked all white, that was not fun at all, let me tell you. So I was really glad to get out, but it just didn't really change anything. When we landed in the new neighborhood, I had no friends. We were still poor, and on top of it all, my dad had just found out that he was dying of lung cancer. Life sucked. But being in a gang changed all that. At least for a little while, anyway. I mean, I finally had friends again. After years and years of almost everyone in the old neighborhood treating me like some piece of dirt because of my background, having friends and being part of a group was just a phenomenal thing to me. I'd have done any amount of low-rent gangbanging for that kind of buzz. It didn't matter that I had very little in common with any of these people besides the fact that we were all poor. I was into some pretty nerdy stuff. Star Wars, D&D, that sort of thing. They were all into boxing and stuff, which I thought was kind of lame, but it didn't matter. It was us against the world. I'll admit, we did some pretty scumbag things. Broke into a few houses and beat the life out of this old guy who caught us stealing from him. Like, yeah, we did our fair share of dumb stuff, but for the most part, we just hung out together and acted like stupid kids who dreamed of being big-time gangbangers. And that same summer I first joined ended with me doing a 2-month-long stint in the Lake County Juvenile Center, which made living in the projects seem like paradise by comparison. It didn't quite put me off to the whole lifestyle. In hindsight, I realized that we were all just ghetto runts who had banded together, but at the time it was like a brotherhood that I didn't know I desperately needed until I had it. They were there at my pap's funeral. They showed up to my grandpa's funeral too. They were actually there for me, you know. And for a long time I didn't think there was a thing in the world that could make me turn my back on it. But as it turns out, there was something that could make me leave that life behind. Something that made me realize that what we were doing wasn't a game, and something that made it clear to me that I just didn't have what it takes to live that lifestyle. So we had this little homie, Lewis, and Lewis was smart. If there was anyone who was actually going to make some money and get anywhere in life, it was Lewis. He was a grade above us in school too, so he was getting involved with girls, going on little dates with them. He was a good-looking kid, so he was popular like that. Anyway, Lewis is playing it cool with all these sophomore girls until he gets real stuck on this one particular chick called Vanessa. They start dating, and after that we barely saw Lewis. He spent pretty much all of his time hanging out with her. Not long after, he started getting more responsibility in the gang. He was putting in work for the big homies in East Chicago, so he had barely any time to hang out with us in general. I mean, I was happy for him, but it sucked that he wasn't around as much. Then, around Halloween time, I got a call from Lewis asking if he can stay at my house for a few days. I said, yeah, sure. Like, my mom worked so much that she barely noticed if he was there, and It would be a great opportunity to catch up. But when Lewis gets to my house, he wasn't exactly in a catching up kind of mood, and to be honest, he looked terrible too. Like he looked like he barely slept, and when I offered him something to eat, he tore into it and tried to give me a $50 bill afterward, like I just saved his life or something. I asked him what was wrong, but he tries to pretend like everything's cool. I figured he would just tell me what it is when he was good and ready, so I didn't chase it, but later on, when he lifted up his shirt a little and showed me the gun tucked into his waistband, I demanded to know why he was acting so weird, and if the gun had anything to do with it. It came as no surprise when he said that it did, and that he had it on him to protect himself. I asked who he might need protection from, and he just says, "The big homies." The whole story that came next was pretty long and complicated, so I'll try to make it simple. Basically, Lewis had to go grab a package for one of those big homies, who then said whatever was in that package was short, and their conclusion was that Lewis had stolen from them. I asked Lewis if it was true, if he actually did steal some money or some drugs or something, and he said no, but I don't know if I really believed him. But whatever he did or didn't steal anything, these bigs were looking for him, and Lewis seemed absolutely terrified of what they might do if they got their hands on him. He stayed in my house a couple of days, but he mostly spent all his time either looking out my bedroom window or texting his girlfriend Vanessa. What I figured would be a good chance to catch up turned into an episode of The Fugitive. And the next thing I know, he's asking if this Vanessa girl can stay at my house for a couple of days too, because he can't be out there just walking around, and he said he missed her. I'm pretty sure that's where my mom would draw the line, but being the good friend that I was, I agreed to hide her in my room for a night or two so they could hang out. So my mom goes out to work her 12-hour shift down at the hospital, and that was Lewis's signal to invite Vanessa over. He calls, they talk, and she was due over at my mom's place in like 30 minutes. Half hour goes by and there's no sign of Vanessa. Then an hour goes by and there's still no sign of her. And as you can imagine, Lewis is getting pretty worried. He's calling her, she's not picking up. He starts freaking out, and I try to reassure him. In the end, we'd come to an agreement that her parents had grounded her for trying to sneak out at night and had confiscated her phone. It was nothing he could do anything about, and there was no point panicking. It was only when he had that in his head that I could actually get any sleep. The next morning, my mom's making us breakfast before she goes to sleep off her night shift. She's cooking pancakes, and she has the radio on while she's doing it. Lewis is acting all chill at first, but then he heard something on the radio that made him go white as a sheet. All I heard was that some guy had set a fire somewhere in East Chicago, and at first, I didn't understand why Lewis was so freaked out about it. It was only later when we heard that the fire department had pulled a charred body out of the burned-out car that I really started to get it. Lewis broke down crying, telling me he knew in his gut that the body belonged to none other than his girlfriend, Vanessa. I tried to comfort him, tell him there's no way he could have been sure of it. The corpse was so badly burned that they had to examine the person's dental records to work out who it was. But work it out they did, and guess what? It was exactly who Lewis thought it was. It was Vanessa. According to Lewis, the big homies must have worked out that she was his girl, then picked her up right as she was leaving to come over to Mom's place. Vanessa knew where he was hiding out that night, and the fact that we didn't get a visit from her while she ended up dead in a car fire is a testament to the fact that she didn't open her mouth. She kept Lewis, and probably me too, safe that night, and she paid for it with her life. Lewis couldn't even go to her funeral. He figured the big homies would send some people to watch it, see if he turned up, and from what I heard, that's exactly what they did. The day of the funeral, I went down to the corner store to pick up some Garrett's, thinking it might help Lewis pick himself up a little. I get back to my house, he's not in my room. But out of the window, I can see him on the kids' jungle gym in the park across the street. So I start walking over with his Garrett's, not thinking I'd need to announce myself, and all the while, he's just sat there on the swing, set with just this broken look on his face. And that was the last time I saw Lewis alive, because the next thing I know, he's got the barrel of a pistol on his chin, and he pulls the trigger. I had to watch one of my best friends take his own life. Lewis had only just dipped his toes in the water when it came to rolling with the big homies, so to speak, and it cost him his life and that of his girlfriend. I was ready to be done with the whole gangster dream. It was actually pretty easy for me to get out given how young I was. I know for some of the older guys it's much harder to get out, and a lot of the time your so-called homies would rather see you dead than free. But I just knew that couldn't be my life. I couldn't lose people like that, and if Lewis couldn't handle it, I knew well I couldn't handle it either. I graduated college with a degree in business management a few years back, and I run a home renovation company over in Detroit now. I make okay money, hardly fat stacks or whatever they call it, but it'll do. It's worth it to know that I'd never end up like Lewis, and it's worth it to know that neither will my kids either. The brothers Charlie and Eddie Richardson were born in mid-1930s Britain in a place called Brentford in Middlesex. Their family moved around frequently when they were still children, as their mother and father traipsed around Greater London in search of work. But when the father finally gave up on the family and abandoned them, he plunged his wife and children into utter poverty. Poverty so unbearable that young Charlie and Eddie turned to a life of crime in order to support their mother and younger sister. Maybe it was the desperate desire to care for those they loved that influenced their style of business, but when it came to enforcing their will, the Richardson boys were completely unafraid to employ horror movie levels of torture and violence. Because to them, when it came to taking care of their mom and sister, nothing was off the table. They quickly recruited a number of like-minded psychopaths, and in the 1960s, developed a reputation for being some of London's most sadistic, bloodthirsty criminals. Charlie Richardson owned and operated a large scrap metal yard, whilst his younger brother Eddie set up a company selling slot machines. These businesses were little more than fronts for much more sinister underworld activity, including fraud, racketeering, and storing stolen goods. But it was the scrapyard that became infamous as a place where the Richardsons committed some of the most heinous acts of torture and violence that London has ever seen, with their specialities including pulling teeth out using pliers, cutting off toes using bolt cutters, and nailing victims to floors using 6-inch nails. The Richardsons quickly became known by the terrifying moniker, the Torture Gang. But arguably even more disturbing than the horrific pain they would inflict were the psychological games frequently employed by the Richardson gang. They used mock trials to mentally break down those they were about to torture, with Charlie and Eddie's goons hauling their victims into a makeshift dock while their bosses played at being judge and jury. When the verdict came in, the accused was always guilty, but the punishments tended to suit the crimes. Smaller offenses normally warranted being beaten or whipped, but in the case of more serious offenses, the victim might expect to be burned with cigarettes, have their teeth pulled out with pliers, be nailed to the floor, have toes removed with bolt cutters, or to be given electric shocks until they lost consciousness. The electric shocks were inflicted by an old army field telephone with clipped, exposed wire, one which included a hand crank-powered generator, an ingenious way of creating what was essentially a portable torture device. The victims were most often placed in a bath of cold water to enhance the electrical charge, with the metal clips being attached to the victim's most sensitive areas. Shockingly enough, any of the Richardsons' victims who were too badly injured to leave the scrapyard would be driven over to a disgraced doctor that was on their payroll. The doctor would then fix them up, and in a terrifying display of psychopathic civility, the Richardsons would foot the bill. This bizarre process of trial and torture came to be known as taking a shirt from Charlie because of Charlie Richardson's habit of needing to give each of their torture victims a clean shirt in which to return home, since the shirt the victim had arrived in was usually soaked with gore by the time they had to leave. According to one former member of the torture gang, a money collector in their employ was apparently skimming money off the top of his collections and had to be warned twice already when his counts had come up short. When he was caught gambling some of the money on dog races in nearby Catford, the Richardsons dragged him out to an abandoned warehouse near Tower Bridge that they often used as a hideout. The money collector then had his feet nailed to the floor and was kept as a prisoner for 2 days, in which time several of the gang members used him as a human toilet. But the gang's reign of terror was short-lived, with all of their victims walking around London, telling their horror stories of the vile torment they were subjected to. The Richardsons began to attract all manner of attention, mainly from those that broke the law, but also those that sought to enforce it. And so on July 30th, 1966, the day the English soccer team won the World Cup for their one and only championship, Charlie Richardson had his celebrations spoiled by being arrested on charges of grievous bodily harm. Not long after, the rest of the gang were picked up by police on a variety of charges varying from fraud and extortion to assault and attempted murder. During his trial, there were even rumors that Charlie Richardson had a side hustle going with the South African Bureau of State Security, basically the South African CIA, who had given Charlie the job of bugging the British Prime Minister's phone. But very little of the accusation was actually substantiated. What became known as the torture trial ended with Charlie and his brother being sentenced to 25 years in prison for basically running a torture house in the middle of London. Their incarceration brought about the end of the Richardsons, and the London criminal underworld breathed a collective sigh of relief. Hundreds of them bore the scars of the punishments meted out by the Richardsons' mock trials. They were missing toes, missing teeth, blinded, fingerless, and sported facial burns, and were all haunted by the way the Richardsons laughed while they screamed in agony, over and over again. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. And if you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join a live stream to catch an invite to my Discord. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.